"You're under arrest for impersonating a federal officer," my own brother declared in front of everyone, slamming handcuffs on my wrists as if I were a criminal. The lanterns swayed above us, my grandmother's hands shook, and I sat there silent while my real military badge gleamed against my chest. He thought he had stripped me of everything. What he didn't know was that I had already lived through wars far worse than his lies. He thought he had won. He had no idea who I really was. I'm Elowen Cade, and this is my story. But before I share it with you, I'd love to know you're here with me. Drop a simple hi in the comments so I know you're listening, or let me know where you're watching from. I love to see how far my story can reach. Thank you. And now, let me tell you everything. And if my story moves, you please don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Your support means more than you know, especially for someone who once had to fight alone against her own family. The night was damp at Fort Halstead, the smell of wet pine clinging to the air as rain tapped lightly against the concrete walls. I had just finished a final run-through for an upcoming intelligence operation when the alert pinged across my secure screen. It wasn't from Washington. It wasn't from a handler. It was from Gideon. Subject line: family must reunite. This weekend. That was it. No greeting. No warmth. No trace of anything but command. The sender's signature read, Sheriff Gideon Cade, Pine Hollow Police Department. He wanted me back not as his sister, but as someone he could summon. The words were so clipped, so stripped of feeling that my first reaction was to ignore it. But the tone, so unmistakably Gideon's, an order, not an invitation, settled like lead in my chest. I pulled out my personal mission notebook, the same one I used for field ops, and wrote down what I would need if I returned objective face the family, not to reconcile, but to free myself. Risks: small-town gossip, local law enforcement under Gideon's thumb, possible manipulation of mother and grandmother. Countermeasures: no uniform, plain civilian clothes, travel on a private hop to avoid attention, clean phone beacon hidden in my belt. I reminded myself operational security comes first. Dr. Nora Callahan had warned me during our last session, don't mistake confrontation for reconciliation. Sometimes you face them not to mend, but to release yourself. Her words came back to me with startling clarity as I reread Gideon's email. Memory blurred the page: my father's funeral, the dirt still fresh on his grave, and me boarding the transport bus with a duffel bag heavier than my grief. Gideon had refused to walk me to the station. He stayed back in Pine Hollow under the roof of our mother in the shadow of the farm. He had built his authority on roots, on staying, while I built mine on leaving. That divide had never healed. I dialed my roommate, Captain Marissa Tate. We spoke quickly in the clipped shorthand of soldiers' fallback plan, beacon placement, emergency channels. She knew what Gideon's brand of pride could turn into. If he pushes you, she warned, don't push back. Just signal. We'll handle it. When I opened the reply draft, I typed only 3 words: I will come. No explanation, no defense, nothing to be misread. I packed deliberately: one small bag, identification minimal, a plain coat to cover my form, the hidden emergency device tucked into my belt. I booked the short flight south. By the time I stepped outside, the runway was glistening black under the floodlights. The rain had eased, but the air was heavy. I drew a long breath and repeated to myself the vow: I wasn't going home for Gideon's approval, nor to prove myself to anyone in that town. I was going back for release. My silence would be my weapon. The only question was whether Gideon's call for reunion was real or just a stage he'd built to break me. The plane touched down on a strip of cracked asphalt that called itself Pine Hollow Municipal. I had swapped my base jacket for a plain civilian coat, nondescript, forgettable. The taxi driver, a man with a baseball cap pulled low, studied me in the rearview mirror. You're Sheriff Cade's sister, right? The famous one. His tone was half curiosity, half rumor. In a town this small, my last name carried its own gravity. I forced a neutral smile, gave no confirmation, and let silence fill the cab. As we drove, the town revealed itself like a tableau. I hadn't missed wooden storefronts leaning with age banners strung up for the coming agricultural fair, a statue of the town's founder casting a long shadow across the square. When we rolled past the police department, I couldn't miss the shine of Gideon's patrol truck parked out front. The badge gleamed with his name in bold letters. Above, I spotted a lattice of new community cameras mounted high, little black eyes surveying the streets. Surveillance wrapped in civic duty. Gideon had extended his reach into every corner of Pine Hollow. I noted each change in silence, committing details to memory the way I did on foreign assignments. The townspeople watched me as we passed, some with faint recognition, some as if I were a stranger dropped from the sky. Whispers, hummed nods came stiff. The rhythm was clear. Gideon set the tempo here. The taxi curved around a lot beside the station, and that was when I saw it. Dangling from the key ring of a uniformed tech leaning against the patrol truck was a brass lock. Not just any lock. My lock. The same model, same make, same shallow scratch I'd carved years ago on its side to mark it. The lock that should have been on my rented warehouse unit in Portland. I froze, breath caught. Whoever this man was, he had been inside my storage. How had my lock ended up in his possession? I didn't confront him. Not here, not now. Instead, I scribbled a mental note: sharp and urgent, breach confirmed. We left town square behind, climbing out toward the family farm. The air shifted, smoke of wood fire, the sweet smell of apples baking. The old house rose from the fields, dark timber worn by decades, the vegetable garden tidy and thriving beside it, the barn hunched like an old sentinel. When the taxi rolled to a stop, my grandmother was waiting at the porch. She folded me into her arms, her voice barely a whisper against my ear. "Don't let him pull you into his game." Her words carried more weight than all the stairs in town. Inside, the scent of earth and memory wrapped around me. I stepped onto the porch again, phone in hand. Signal was weak but intact. The beacon channel blinked green. At least one safeguard was still in place. I leaned against the railing, eyes on the distance. A man in a ball cap stood at the far fence line, hammering at posts with unnecessary patience, gaze flicking toward the house more than the wood in his hand. He wasn't a farmhand. He was watching. Another piece on Gideon's board. The evening light fell across the fields, long and gold. I tightened my coat, every nerve alert. Pine Hollow hadn't changed, but Gideon had built his empire here, brick by brick, lock by lock. I was no longer just a sister returning. I was a target stepping onto a stage, and I could already feel the trap closing. I stepped out with a tray of plates and felt the yard tighten around me like wire. The oak spread its arms over the long checkered table, lanterns swayed on thin chains, the grill coughed smoke that smelled like last summer. Gideon was already seated at the head, uniform pressed to a knife's edge, hat set beside his plate like a badge on velvet. That seat had always been my grandmother's. Tonight she sat at the corner, smaller than I remembered, hands folded in her lap, as if she were a guest in her own home. My mother kept her eyes on the serving bowls, passing them with the gentle obedience of habit, and never once letting her gaze land on mine. Everything I needed to know about the order of things was right there in the seating chart. The man at the fence made a slow arc along the posts, never fully looking our way, and somehow seeing everything. He wore a ball cap and the slouch of a laborer, but his feet told on him angles and pauses that weren't about wood or wire. I kept him in my peripheral vision and pretended not to. I asked about the roadwork on Main, the fair's new livestock rules, whether the McCrae herd recovered after the early frost. My voice stayed even, almost bored. Gideon answered like a mayor at a ribbon, cutting the corners of his mouth, pulled into a public smile that didn't reach his eyes. Beneath the cordial phrases ran the same message: you left, I stayed, and everything here runs on my clock. Cousins murmured little compliments about the department's new grant, the patrol response times, the way the town felt safer now. My name drifted through the conversation like a weather report acknowledged unimportant. Forks clinked. The radio cut off mid-song. The hush that followed wasn't peaceful. It was theater lighting dropping over the set. I refilled grandmother's water and bent to place it by her hand. The edge of a folder peeked from under her chair cream cardstock with courthouse lettering. I slid it back into shadow as I set the glass down, but not before I saw the words that mattered. Probate. Durable power of attorney. The agent line filled in with his name. A small sticky note dog-eared on the first page, ink scrawled in hurried blue needs EK's signature. The water in my chest turned to ice. This reunion wasn't a meal. It was pressure measured in ounces and initials. I straightened and smiled at my grandmother as if I hadn't seen it. Heat from the grill wrapped my shoulders, but my palms were cold. Gideon joked about the fair's pie contest, and his hand brushed the cuff case on his belt as if by accident. The man at the fence glanced toward the barn, then back to the posts, carving his slow circle around our evening. The message was clear. There were angles I couldn't see, a reveal waiting in the wings. Cousins compared venison marinades and college acceptances. Someone asked if I was still traveling for work, and I said yes, keeping my vowels flat. Gideon cut in with a soft laugh about how different our lives were, his words varnished with small-town humility and anchored by a gaze that said, the yard, the house, the air itself were his jurisdiction. I let him perform. Every performance shows its seams if you're patient. Grandmother's fingers found mine as I reached for a bread basket. They barely weighed anything. Don't let him pull you into his game, she whispered so quiet I felt the breath of the words more than I heard them. I squeezed back a promise without sound. The man by the fence stilled. The barn door creaked and then settled. A cough from the grill, a flare of flame. A cousin's laugh that died mid-breath. I tasted metal at the back of my throat. There's a particular silence that arrives just before someone flips a switch. I'd felt it outside dusty embassies, and in rooms where the windows didn't open. I felt it now at my grandmother's table with my family lined up like witnesses. I folded the napkin across my lap and waited for the lights to go up on the next scene. Gideon stood with the confidence of a man used to standing. He tapped a beer glass twice, sharp and bright, and every head lifted. Smoke thinned into cool air. Lanterns rocked. In the second between his inhale and his first word, I knew exactly what would happen and exactly how far I would let it go. He thanked everyone for coming, for loving this family, for believing in the town. Then he pivoted, eyes settling on me with a sympathy I didn't recognize. Some truths are hard, he said, and reached beneath the bench to lift a thick folder. The cardstock thudded the table. He laid out pages like cards in a children's game, carefully spaced so every pair of eyes could follow. He said my full name, my date of birth, and the phrase he had rehearsed that I had been fraudulently claiming a military identity to access federal resources. He announced it as if it hurt him to do so, as if duty had pressed his hand. The man from the fence, no longer pretending to be a handyman, came forward at a measured pace, set several glossy photographs beside the papers, and stepped back. Grainy black and white frames of a concrete corridor, a numbered storage unit the shapes of sealed containers under fluorescent hum. The corners were cut to erase context and create a story. I knew the story in color with dates and clearance codes that would never be printed for a backyard jury. A cousin sucked in air. Someone muttered that I should be ashamed. My mother's spoon settled in the bowl with the softest click. My grandmother's knuckles went pale around her water glass. I didn't speak. I let him keep going. He described how he had discovered inconsistencies, how concerned citizens had noticed anomalies, how he had responsibly engaged a licensed investigator. He said he had assembled proof because he could not allow our family name to be dragged through headlines. He never said what he really wanted: control-signed papers, a confession shaped like gratitude. He didn't need to. The folder said it for him. He asked me to stand. I didn't. He stepped around the table, stopped at my shoulder, and I felt the heat of his body and the chill of the metal he was about to touch. When his hand closed around my wrist, it was professional and personal all at once. The cuff ratcheted shut with a sound that made the lantern seem louder. Pain flashed along bone, a bright stripe that settled into a throb. The second cuff clicked before any breath returned. Around us, the family froze. No one rose. No chair scraped. The silence wasn't fear. It was choreography. They had been cast as audience, and they were staying in their seats. I lifted my eyes not to him, but to the fence line. Tucked in the shadow where two boards met, a small dark lens watched the table. The angle was deliberate, the height planned. This wasn't just about humiliating me in a backyard. He wanted an external witness, a record to point to later when he called his version truth. The cuffs bit again as he adjusted my elbows for the camera. The investigator placed a final sheet on the table, an enlarged print of a partially visible document from my unit's work, cropped, stripped of classification headers, the language forced to read, like forgery. My grandmother whispered my name. My mother stared at her plate as if it might save her. I brought the breath in slowly, the way training teaches when there's no exit yet. The ache in my wrists sharpened thought. I tracked the details, the investigator's eyes, which flicked not to Gideon but to the camera, the small tremor in my cousin's hand, the way Gideon's tongue pressed the inside of his cheek when he paused for effect. He believed this was the moment he broke me. He believed that if he said it with enough authority, the town would echo it until it became fact. I could have said a dozen things. I could have named clearances, called case officers, recited acronyms that would make him flinch. Instead, I counted the beats between the lantern's sway and the chill settling over the grass. The cuffs dug into skin, and I let them. My silence wasn't surrender. It was calibration. Gideon turned to the table and told them he had no choice. He called me a danger to the family. He said the county would be notified by morning. Someone muttered the word no one here understood. My cousins watched me like they were waiting for an explosion. The investigator shifted his weight, the toe of his boot grinding a pale crescent in the dirt. I stared at the lens tucked in the fence and imagined a small red light blinking somewhere beyond town, marking time. He had prepared his proof. He had rehearsed his speech. He had set a stage. He didn't know he'd also started a clock. The night air cooled the sweat at the back of my neck. Somewhere a calf bawled from the far pasture and the barn answered with a hollow echo. Gideon's voice kept moving, righteous, and practiced filling the yard with a story he needed more than anyone to be true. I let the story wash past me. I had already chosen the only role that mattered. I sat still. My hands bound, my jaw unclenched, and counted down in the quiet only I could hear. The lantern snapped in the wind, and the yard darkened by a shade, the kind that makes people lower their voices without knowing why. Children were ushered inside with a rustle of sweaters and a shh from the kitchen door. I shifted my hips, as if getting comfortable, felt the hidden ridge in my belt and pressed. No light. No sound. Only the faintest vibration against bone, an old friend waking up. Somewhere beyond this yard, a thread went taut between me and Fort Halstead. Gideon said my name with the slow emphasis of a judge. He called me an impersonator, a liar wearing a uniform I had not earned, and he did it as if he were saving me from myself. The cuffs cut another crescent into my wrist when I adjusted my shoulders. I kept my eyes level and gave him nothing to bounce off. My grandmother's hand found my shoulder and settled there like a bird. "You don't have to explain yourself to them," she breathed. Her voice didn't rise above the scrape of a chair leg, but it steadied the ground beneath my feet. In a yard arranged to make me small, one person refused the arrangement. Caleb cleared his throat with the courage of a man who only sometimes defies the room. "If she's pretending," he asked into the hush, "why hasn't the Department of Defense shown up?" The question hung awkward and earnest, bumping against the edges of Gideon's performance. The silence that followed wasn't respectful. It was confused. Gideon had choreographed outrage, not logic. For the first time, his jaw tightened without a smile to hide it. I thought of the anonymous email Fort Halstead received 2 days ago, just enough detail to trip the right alarms, just enough family context to point the warning our way. The message had read like someone tossing a flare from a moving truck, clumsy, urgent, impossible to ignore. Standing here with brass cutting into my skin and a camera eye watching from the fence, I knew that flare had not been an accident. Someone close to Gideon had peeled back a corner of his plan. I didn't know if they did it out of conscience fear or petty revenge. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I was not alone on this stage, no matter how carefully he had tried to isolate me. The investigator hat off now, eyes clearer than they had been at the fence hovered at the edge of the table. When our gazes met, something shifted. Not loyalty, not apology. A recognition that he had been hired to play a role, and the script had just started to burn. He looked away first toward the lens tucked in the boards, and I filed the tremor of hesitation for later. Gideon doubled down. He recited dates, referenced forms, invented gaps that he claimed only a guilty person would leave. He said the county had a duty to act. He pointed to the folder and to the photographs as if paper could testify. The lanterns clicked against their hooks. The grill hissed and went quiet. I counted my breath against the fear rising in my mother's throat across the table. She still wouldn't look at me, and I couldn't blame her for not knowing which story would keep the ground from opening under our feet. I kept my body still and listened to the rhythm beneath his sentences. People in crisis talk in circles. People hungry for power talk in ladders. Gideon's voice climbed rung by rung toward a conclusion he had already decided. I wanted to pull the ladder from under him. Instead, I steadied my breath and let the seconds line up. The beacon had gone out into the dark, and there are moments when all a soldier can do is hold formation. Behind me, the kitchen door shut on the last trailing whisper of a child. From the fields came the thrum of insects and the faint metal rattle of a loose gate. The cuffs ached a bright line I rode like a rail to stay present. My grandmother's hand left my shoulder and returned to her glass. Caleb's eyes moved between me and Gideon as if trying to reconcile his childhood with the scene in front of him. I closed my eyes and took one measured inhale, then another. I wasn't counting minutes anymore. I was counting heartbeats. Gravel whispered at the end of the drive tires, compressing the night into a single low growl. Headlights swept the fence white across the boards, then clicked off. The yard heard the doors before it understood them. Two shapes crossed the threshold of the gate with the calm of people who had done this in courtyards and kitchens and motel hallways across the country. Badges flashed quick and official. Gideon Cade the lead, said hands where we can see them. Step away. He didn't. His palm stayed anchored to the grip of his holstered weapon, more habit than threat, but the message was plain. This was his property, his family, his rules. He threw those words like stakes in the dirt. Private land, protecting reputation, doing what had to be done. The lanterns swung in a small frenzy above our heads, and in their pulse I saw the years we had lost to stubbornness. The woman with the badge spoke again, unhurried. Special Agent Lena Carver. She nodded toward her partner without breaking eye contact. We're operating under federal authority. Sheriff, remove your hand from your weapon. She took a folded paper from an inner pocket and read in a voice that did not need volume to be heard. Possession of classified material without authorization, interference with an ongoing federal operation, detainment of a federal officer outside lawful custody. Each count laid down like stone. The yard seemed to shrink by a foot. A cousin's chair scraped. My mother's fingers clenched the edge of the tablecloth as if it might steady the table itself. Gideon's mouth opened around an argument I had heard since childhood and could recite in my sleep. He said he was protecting the family from shame, the town from a scandal, himself from a betrayal. The words sounded thin under the wash of authority that had just rolled into his yard. Bootsteps at the gate again, heavier, slower. The man who entered didn't need to announce himself. Dignity walked in ahead of him. He wore a plain field jacket that somehow looked more formal than a dress uniform. He crossed the lawn with the measured certainty of someone who never had to prove he belonged wherever he stood. When his eyes found mine, they didn't search. "Colonel Cade," he said, and though the title was simple, it dropped through the performance around us like an anchor. Conversations died in people's throats. The investigator took a step back without meaning to. My grandmother exhaled a sound that could have been relief. Gideon went still in a way I recognized from patrol videos, officers who realize the script is not the one they imagined. He shifted his stance but didn't step aside. If Carver noticed the pride crack across his face, she gave no sign. She gestured to the fence line, and a second agent moved to the tiny lens set into the boards. "Record this," Carver said to nobody in particular, which is how you talk when you know it's already being recorded. The photographs were gathered, labeled. The folder was lifted by gloved hands and slipped into a bag. Carver's partner knelt to look at the hardware on my wrists, and then checked the angle of the camera for the frame it had captured. The story Gideon had tried to stage was repurposed, every prop re-tagged. He had wanted proof. He had made it. Now it belonged to someone else. The investigator's face shifted from professional blankness to something like conscience. He pulled a sheaf of papers from his jacket, stared at them as if hoping the ink would move, then let them fall onto the grass where the dew had begun to gather. His voice sounded wrong in his own mouth when he said Gideon had pushed him into a break-in, that he had been told the unit in Portland contained fake records, that he had been told it was for the town's good. Words came out flat, as if he hated how they sounded on the air. He pointed to the lock, to the photographs, to the edges that had been trimmed to change meaning. It didn't redeem him. It didn't need to. It drew a clean line from intent to action. Carver nodded once, not gracious, just acknowledging the utility of truth. She looked at my wrists, then at Gideon. "Keys," she said. The pause that followed felt longer than it was. He reached for the pouch at his belt with the reluctance of a man removing his own title. The metal clicked open. Blood rushed back to my hands with pins and fire. I kept my face still. Gratitude can be private. Colonel Harlan took half a step closer and lowered his voice so the words wouldn't carry past the table. "You're good," he said, which in our world meant more than comfort. It meant the perimeter was secured, the plan was intact, the rest would be handled. He didn't ask for my account. He didn't need it. He'd come for the situation, not the drama. Gideon tried again. He said I had lied to this family for years, that the badge I wore in my heart was fraudulent, even if the medal was not, that I had abandoned the farm and the mother who stayed. He spoke to the agents as if this yard were still a jury, and they were guests who ought to be polite. Carver let him finish. Then she told him he was suspended pending formal charges, and that he was not to leave the county. Her voice carried the weight of consequence without the heat of anger. It landed harder that way. A murmur rose from the porch where a neighbor had appeared, drawn by lights and instinct. The town would know by morning. The story would travel in church kitchens and over fence rails and under the dim glow of the diner's neon sign. None of that was my concern. I had a grandmother to steady and a spine to keep straight. My hands were free, but I didn't rub the marks. I stood beside the chair where I had been made to sit and let the night settle around us. In the space where he had expected me to plead, I chose quiet. There was nothing I could say that would help him, and nothing I needed to say to help myself. Recognition had arrived without my voice. That was enough. Carver and her partner began the slow work of leaving a scene better than they found it. Evidence sealed, statements marked, instructions given. The investigator's confession collected like a shard placed in the proper envelope. Colonel Harlan inclined his head to my grandmother as he passed an old-fashioned courtesy that looked right in his hands. I looked at Gideon and saw that the fire in his eyes had not guttered. It had changed color. He was already moving the battlefield in his mind, from yard to courthouse, from neighbors to strangers in suits. I had known him long enough to recognize that he would not bow in a backyard, not even to the truth. Fine. I wasn't asking him to. As the agents crossed back through the gate and the headlights stitched the fence one more time, I felt the tension in the yard release by a fraction. The night air was colder than before. Somewhere above us, a night bird called brief and questioning. I stepped to my grandmother's side and took her hand. Her palm was warm, small, stubborn. This was not over, but it had left this lawn and entered a room with rules he didn't write. I watched Gideon stare into the dark as if he could will it into daylight, then turn my face toward the road where the dust was already settling back into place. 8 months after the night under the lanterns, I walked into the federal courthouse in Salem. The building rose from glass and steel sharp and unyielding as if it had been designed to strip sentiment out of every proceeding. Cameras flashed outside the steps. Reporters called my last name, like it belonged to them, and strangers from Pine Hollow craned for a look. I kept my head level, my coat buttoned, and my voice to myself. Inside the courtroom was cool, the kind of temperature that kept nerves from sweating. I chose a seat near the back, not in uniform, only a dark suit that let me fade into the rows. Even there I felt the eyes, neighbors, local journalists, curious townsfolk who wanted to see what the sheriff's feud had become. Their stares asked me for a story, but I had no intention of giving them one. When Gideon entered the room, shifted. He wore county orange shackles clinking against the polished floor, and the posture of a man trying to will his spine straight. Gone was the pressed uniform, the polished badge, the authority he carried like an inheritance. His jaw was locked, but the lines around his mouth betrayed exhaustion. For a moment I saw not a sheriff but my brother, and the pang in my chest was real. Then the bailiff announced his charges, and the room sealed back into its order. The prosecutor laid out the case with methodical precision. Footage from the hidden camera. Gideon had arranged the testimony of the investigator. He had coerced the seized folder of classified documents photographed out of context, the evidence that he had staged the arrest of a federal officer in his own backyard. Each piece of proof landed heavy and undeniable. The logic was simple: he had sought to humiliate me, and in doing so had crossed lines that no badge could protect him from. His attorney tried to soften the edges. He spoke of duty, of family honor, of Gideon's intent to guard his community against deceit. He called it suspicion, not malice. But suspicion wilts when stacked against chains of custody, sworn statements, and the clear sight of a camera that had recorded every action Gideon had thought would crown him victorious. The defense sounded like excuses, and the judge's eyes did not waver. When my name was called, the room leaned forward. Some faces expected a confrontation. Some wanted the catharsis of hearing me denounce him. Others simply craved spectacle. I did not rise. Instead, the clerk read aloud the written affidavit I had submitted. It was plain, spare, factual dates, assignments, credentials, nothing more. No adjectives. No fury. Just truth. The courtroom stilled at the absence of drama. My silence did what speeches never could. It placed the weight back onto the evidence, away from the family wound Gideon had tried to brandish as weapon. He couldn't leave it there. When given the chance to speak for himself, he turned his words not to the law, but to me. He told the court I had abandoned our father's memory by leaving for the military, that I had left him to carry the burden of the farm and the town. He accused me of erasing history, of choosing ambition over duty. His voice cracked not with grief, but with anger sharpened by years. The spectators murmured, not in agreement, but in recognition. They were watching not just a trial, but the skeleton of sibling rivalry laid bare in federal light. I wanted to answer, to tell them that I had not abandoned anything. That service had been my way of honoring the man who raised us. But the urge passed. The court was not built to measure grief or envy. It weighed actions, not motives. And so I stayed still, hands folded in my lap, eyes fixed ahead. The judge's gavel brought silence. He spoke in clipped syllables, guilty on multiple counts, sentence of 10 years in federal prison, permanent bar from public office, prohibition from firearm possession. The sound of the gavel striking wood echoed through the chamber, sharp as a shot, final as a door closing. I did not flinch. The burden I had carried since that email in the barracks, the burden of being measured against Gideon's pride, of being trapped in a contest I had never entered, slipped loose. The chain did not break. It simply no longer bound me. Autumn arrived early in Washington. Mist clung to the runway at Fort Halstead, blurring the edges of pine and steel. From the tall windows of the command room, I watched the sun push through the fog in bands of gold. My team moved below me, preparing for the next assignment, their voices brisk, their energy alive. I had been promoted into a role that braided intelligence with diplomacy, the kind of position that required both calculation and the trust of those who followed. For the first time in years, I felt the weight on my shoulders was chosen, not imposed. My inbox pinged. The subject line froze me for only a moment: Gideon Cade, Federal Correctional Facility, Idaho. I didn't open it. The first line of the preview revealed enough: an apology dressed in explanations, regret tangled with excuses. I dragged it to the trash and cleared the folder until nothing remained. Release sometimes is not about answers, but about refusing the question. Later that week, I drove to Portland to see my grandmother. The nursing home smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender, a mix of care and inevitability. She was thinner, her eyes clouded but still sharp with humor. She handed me a book, an adventure novel worn at the corners, and asked me to read aloud. My voice filled the quiet room until her breathing steadied, and for a while the years fell away. When she asked softly about Gideon, I said only, "He's alive." It was enough. It was the only truth that mattered to her, and it was the only one I was willing to carry forward. I thought of my mother then, her silence at the table, her refusal to meet my eyes, the resignation that had lined her face. She had chosen her kind of survival, and I had chosen mine. Some distances cannot be closed. I accepted that, and let the ache pass through me like air. Back at the base, as I reviewed the day's reports, one of my officers lingered after the others left. He was younger, earnest, too careful with his words. "Sir," he said, though I had long since given them permission to use my first name off duty, "sometimes a quiet ally is the only one that matters." The way he said it made my breath pause. I realized then it had been him, the anonymous warning sent to Fort Halstead before the night at the farm. I didn't ask why. Some debts don't need to be spoken. I nodded once, and that was the only acknowledgement required. On my desk lay the small black notebook I had carried since the beginning. The last page bore the line I had written months before: "Face them not to reconcile, but to release yourself." I closed the cover with a finality that felt like a seal. The mission I had set at the start was complete. Outside, the morning stretched clear. I walked to the window, inhaled the cold bite of air seeping through the frame, and felt the steadiness of ground that belonged to me. The forest framed the runway. The hum of engines carried from the hangar, and the cadence of orders below rose like music. Pine Hollow was still there, with its fairs and its rumors and its narrow judgments, but it no longer owned a piece of me. I had carved that piece back at cost, at silence, at patience. Now it was mine again. I breathed deep, letting the autumn air fill me. For the first time in years, there were no chains at my wrists, no eyes on my back that could define me. My freedom was not loud, not celebrated, but quiet and absolute. In that quiet, I was finally home.